years has passed. Ancillary fireworks explode aimlessly against the noon sun, the diminutive light of dusk, the darkness of night. Munitions will run out by Epiphany, only to be refortified with Carnival. A constant rumble besieges the small towns all the way to the haciendas along the Campeche border. The boys that guard interstate travel dream of fusillades as they doze in the shade. The quiet of March will be uncanny. Today in Muna, the heat collects in the pavement, throbs, dilates, retains the summer like a grudge. The city holds its inhabitants in its mouth. At daybreak, they begin the quotidian task of rolling between its cheeks. Perched on the knee of 261 and the disused Rudebuck Road, the odd inn hushes the zeal of the jungle. Here, Nanette, the proprietor, swings her feet from the heat of the bed, her heat deposited in a soft rectangular account to the cool floors. The inn is quiet except for the greedy sound of the air conditioner sucking from the rumbling generator out back. There were no guests last night, and there likely won't be, at least until the piscina is completed. Every morning in the cool shower, for which she paid lavishly, as before her occupation, the town of Santa Elena was not only bereft of electricity, but indoor plumbing. She thinks of the 5 or so kilometers between the ancient facade of the Uxmal ruins and her guest house. In daylight, a wild, overgrown shoelace of a road, overhanging fronds and canopied S-curves. At night, pitch black and plagued by the bobbing headlights of drunken interlopers on motos. Often flooded, often neglected, frightening to even the most fearless expats such as herself. Toweling off in front of the mirror after psychically traversing the rambling road several times, she glances out the window. There, as always, a malnourished swayback bull tethered to a stake bears witness to her daily failure. A knock at the door announces the arrival of Maria, the teenager from town who changes the sheets once a week like a nurse rotating an invalid to prevent bed sores. Her long, wavy hair had gone slack since her pregnancy. The once vibrant and curious child Annette had met nearly 7 months ago, now stout and surly with child. As if to demonstrate this, Maria passes wordlessly through the doorway and climbs the adobe stairs to the airy second floor. Dragging the canvas laundry sack behind her, Nanette thinks she should worry about the innate dangers of a teenager in an advanced state of pregnancy, towing 40 pounds of anything upstairs. But instead, she thinks about how these Mayan girls' bodies are made for Maria's 2 burdens, how the sack leaves coarse fibers and a dun scent lingering on the sheets. The funds from Nanette's divorce were allocated in the following ways. First for the Yucatec land, then for its development and construction. Concurrently for the rental of a flat in York owned by a slim spinster who was so characteristically similar to Nanette that it made their neighbors uncomfortable. 10 months of this, with incidentals including food, gasoline, and entertainment expenses. A one-way plane ticket to Cancun via New York, alongside rival co-eds bound for various degrees of debauchery. An old Peugeot that got stuck in the mud upon its initial mount of the inn's driveway. A subsequent 4-wheel drive Jeep with a manual transmission. Linens, labor. Maria's child would be supported by wages earned from 10 years of a loveless marriage, a Brazilian mistress, and Nanette's inability to produce her own heir. Though most of the inn's furnishings were ordered from the States, Nanette had recently dedicated herself to obtaining decorative items handmade by local Mayans. Her patronage of these objects was duly rewarding. The carved wooden masks, the crudely painted idols and tightly woven mats, all added an air of authenticity to the guest rooms while placating a certain gnawing guilt she experienced for the first time upon her arrival in Mexico. Santa Elena, in its obscurity, was the best place to purchase these items, though it took Nanette some time to discover this. Lonely upon her move nearly a year ago, she took to strolling the dusty streets of town in the early evening, after the sun's heat had burned off. At first she stayed close to the Spanish Mission, the town's only structure hinting its sturdiness, and the sunburnt plaza, where dirty urchins fired dusty soccer balls at each other, less in play than in what seemed like friendly execution. Rounding the far corner of the plaza one evening, she heard the clipped steps of a dog behind her. In New York, she had an old toy poodle that she feared would not survive the journey, nor the compulsory quarantine, so she entrusted him to her roommate's care for the remainder of his short life. She was certainly fond of dogs. These Mexican perros were less dogs than feral, bedraggled beasts. Turning to face her antagonist, she was momentarily overcome by a sense of resignation. She had a brief but strong desire to sit down and calmly allow the large, salivating dog to pick away at her flesh. Regaining her composure, she stamped her feet and shouted, making gestures that communicated to the animal that she was bigger, even if it did seem to have a stronger will to live. This only served to embolden the dog, as it lifted its head skywards and howled. The children on the square stopped their game, pointed and laughed. The gawky gringa and old street dog, muttering to each other in two equally unintelligible languages. Perhaps motivated more by embarrassment than fear, Nanette turned from the square and began walking quickly down the dirt road, leading away from the inn. The line of bodegas closest to the plaza thinned as she walked, and the dog matched her uneven pace. She banked right onto a steep, narrow path, pocked by horse tracks and shaded by palms. She climbed without regard to distance, only desiring a primal sense of the way. Finally, she stopped and turned to discover she was no longer being pursued. Placing her hands on her knees, she gratefully gasped the damp air. Her breathing slowed, and she once again heard the sounds of the jungle, the rustling vines in the wind, the squeal of tropical birds in the trees, overwhelming the small sounds of the town below. Canopy obscured the sky, and darkness was beginning to fall, rendering the road murky with indistinguishable silhouettes. Quickly, she retraced her steps down the hill. The dog revealed itself to her as the town road appeared from behind the bend of the path. It seemed to be awaiting her, its blood less strong, but not strong enough to undertake the path's steep incline. Upon seeing her, it bared its teeth and began howling again, lunging towards her in eager anticipation. Behind her, a laugh sounded, small but loud, and cruel in a way that guaranteed it was girlish. A rock hurtled past her head and struck the dog's backside. Another voice, distinct from the laughter, but just as young, shouted, "Aye, Claudia, no." A teenage girl was ejected from the thick brush along the path. She began half running, half tripping down toward the road, the effect making it seem as though she was skipping. A few moments later, another girl emerged from the brush and glared at Nanette. This hostility made Nanette uncomfortable, so she continued down the path to find the first girl squatting beside the beast. The dog had rolled on its back, exposing a row of sagging nipples. Though the girl seemed comfortable touching it and the dog pleased, it continued to intermittently nip and growl at her. This was Maria. At first, Nanette did not like Maria. Something about the girl's easy way, her kindness, was off-putting. She took Nanette's hand and led her back up the hill, sometimes dragging her along the steeper portions, patiently holding low-hanging palms above her head as Nanette passed. All of this made her feel as though she was guilty of some ancient wrong. Maria spoke no English, but consistently addressed Nanette in a pleasurably up-lilting and confident Mayan. The other girl, the mean one, followed behind them, occasionally snarling back in a Spanish which Maria barely understood, or at least rarely responded to. The ascent continued until they reached a small clearing where a semicircle of forced-out palapas stood sentinel in the otherwise untouched forests. A thin, brindled horse lifted its head in a half-hearted greeting, then returned to grazing on the lush jungle grass. Nanette was guided into the center structure, where two older women were belaboring a large bowl of cornmeal into dishes of varying degrees of edibility. Rather than surprised, these women seemed exhausted by Nanette's presence, as if they were tired of Maria dragging oversized white women home and asking permission to keep them. They shooed them both outside, where Maria busied herself making a fire. Just as abruptly as Maria had appeared on the road, Jesus came up the trail, whistling low into the near darkness. The mean girl abandoned her conceit of cruelty and began to run towards him. Then, as if remembering Nanette's presence, slowed to a confident stride. Hands slung low on her waist, the two returned to Maria and Nanette at the fire. Jesus possessed a sly smile that imparted a blessed lifetime of being both handsome and charming, and he also spoke near perfect English. He had a way about him that she would later, and somewhat reluctantly, describe in letters to her former roommate as distinctively Western. He quickly explained to her that the mean girl, Claudia, was his daughter, the two old women his aunts, and Maria his orphan niece. Though the rudimentary estate had been in his Mayan family for a long time, probably since antiquity, he joked, he found it more beneficial for his construction business to live in nearby Muna. Would Nanette like to stay for dinner? Would she like a ride back home afterwards?